Welcome to the Voxgig podcast. We talk to people in the developer community about developer relations, public speaking, and community events. For more details, visit voxgig.com/podcast. All right, let's get started. Today I'm speaking to Colm Doyle, who is head of developer relations at Intercom. Colm was previously in a similar role at Slack, so he kinda knows his stuff. What's interesting about this conversation is his personal journey into developer relations, and in particular, developer relations leadership. As developer relations has become a recognized function in the software business, we're starting to see the importance of the leadership role when it comes to making developer relations work. We spent a lot of time talking to guests just about developer advocacy, but in this podcast, we're focusing on the role of the leader when it comes to setting up a developer relations team, structuring that team, motivating the advocates, and making it all work. So, without further ado, let's talk to Colm, who kind of knows how to do this stuff. Colm, welcome to the Fireside with Voxgig podcast. Great to have you on today, talking about developer relations.
Right, thanks for having me, Richard. I'm excited to see what we talk about.
Awesome. So, given all the wonderful stuff that's happening with APIs being taken away and given back and all that sort of stuff by companies that shall not be named, and given your experiences working for some of the larger tech companies, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about long-term care and feeding of APIs. So companies, and we were just talking about Twitter as a good example, sometimes throw up APIs without really thinking about the strategic implications. Twitter famously let anybody build Twitter clones effectively using their API. Subsequently thought that was a bad idea and then made it easy again and then took it away again. All sorts of carry on. If you were put in the position now with all that benefit of hindsight for a large tech company that had ChatGPT, for example, right? That's maybe a good one. OpenAPI is taken off, or OpenAI. What do we do? What do you do to manage their API and the developer relations for the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so I guess if your target market is like people building for business or for profit or some kind of return, I guess the big priority is like stability, right? And I guess there's as a DevRel person, you're going to be constantly balancing like stability with innovation, right? Because they can sometimes be at odds with each other, right? Because you can have a really strictly versioned API and then constantly be iterating and bumping your API versions, but then you're building up all this technical debt, which will eventually slow you down. I think like you say, Twitter's kind of thing at the start was, it made sense for them to let people build clients atop their API so that they could essentially, as you say, build Twitter clones or like supplant the Twitter UI. But I guess at the start, Twitter didn't really have a UI. Like it was all through SMS, and you could argue that Twitter wouldn't be what it is today without particularly their iOS clients. You know what I mean? But they were bottling kind of a unique moment in time. But like you say, with the benefit of hindsight, like it was a terrible move. Like when I worked at Facebook, our APIs were pretty clear from the outset that you weren't to use them to build a Facebook clone, because we were really passionate about like controlling that experience and not letting other people just like get between us and our users. So I think you have you essentially have to advocate, like, because you're advocating for your developers, and that doesn't necessarily just mean build this feature or build that feature or fix this bug, but it also means making sure that the business has some kind of strategy around their APIs. Because if you don't have, you have to have a strategy if you want to be a platform, right? If you just want like a goofy hook for someone to do something, then sure, you can throw up an API or two. But a platform is not a platform without a strategy and being able to explain to developers like why they should invest their time and energy in building atop your platform. And like for companies like Slack, that was like there was momentum there, you know what I mean? And we were, we were really getting, we were like a big footprint, particularly in tech. So like if that was your target audience, we were kind of the elephant in the room. You couldn't not integrate with us. You know what I mean? So that was the strategy was for the companies integrating into Slack was like, grabbing onto the side of the rocket ship. But Slack, to be fair, had APIs from the start, and like it was always a big part of the Slack narrative.
Yes,
was
yeah, exactly.
Like it was like, without integrations, Slack was admittedly a lovely, very fully featured client, but it was WhatsApp for business essentially. If you didn't have those integrations, because the idea was if you spent all your time in Slack, then your information should come to you. And the only way we were going to achieve that, because we couldn't go and build into every single service that existed, the only way to do that was to create this kind of symbiotic relationship with developers, whereby like, they would they would give us the data to put in front of their users, and like we would increase the stickiness of their service or something like that. So it's really about being clear that like developers are as much of a persona, because businesses love to talk in personas. You know what I mean? You have admin, like, so at Intercom, where I currently work, we have a notion of there are people who administer your Intercom instance. We have teammates who are like the people answering the conversations, and there are what we call end users, who are like our customers, right? And these are all core personas, but like developers are a persona there as well. They are as important to the business as the teammate or the admin or the whatever. And the Slack was the same. It had admins and it had users, and developers were like a core persona from the very start.
Yeah, you could say in the last two places that you direct experience of, Slack and Intercom, there is a strategy that there are developer personas, but there's thought gone into we're going to have an API, we're going to have developer relations, and there is a long-term commitment to stability.
Yeah. I'm sure there'd be many Slack developers who would argue with that. So joking aside, like a concrete example, Slack doesn't version its APIs, right?
Yeah.
But so there wasn't like, there wasn't like you can if you build an iPhone app, right? Apple has really clear guidelines on how long an API version is going to exist. So if you hook into such and such an API, your iPhone app will work happily until at least this version, right? Now it's slightly different because iOS is like an embedded product and that kind of thing. But you can see the same thing. Like it's Slack, there was a constant request for versioned APIs because people wanted to just turn the thing on, and if they didn't want to adopt a new feature, then they didn't have to. We kind of always wanted to do it, but the real, business needs must, etc. And like we try to mitigate it somewhat by like avoiding breaking changes and having like really long breaking change deadlines. But yes, I think we were a relatively stable API.
Yeah, and compared to Twitter, right, which was one of my first experiences of integrating with APIs and using the Twitter API, which in its day was a great API and it had great docs, but it always felt accidental, right? It didn't feel like a thought out strategy per se. Whereas now, developer relations is an actual thing, and professionally, if we work in developer relations, we should be advocating for a strategy, right? In our companies.
Yeah, no, like the developer's perspective, it's your job to make sure that like the whole roadmap, not just like your API or whatever, like the developer's perspective is taken into account across the whole business roadmap. You know what I mean? Like, how will we monetize the API is an interesting one, because like at Slack, my manager was Bear Douglas, and we would often talk about like, is platform a cost center or is it a revenue center, right? Because the reality is at any business, at some point you need to be a revenue center, because otherwise you're just kind of like a hobby, right? So there has to be a clear way to make money off the platform, and sometimes that's super indirect, right? So like at Slack, we had metrics that told us if if a workspace installed a certain number of apps, then it would increase the stickiness by X%. So like the business strategy there was, our customers will stay around if the AWS integration is really good, or the GitHub integration is really good, or the whatever integration is the strategy. For others, for like Apple, it's we want to take 30% of every time you sneeze. And you can argue whether 30% is a reasonable thing. Like Ben Thompson at Trajectory and John Gruber over at Daring Fireball, they often have fairly heated debates about the validity of Apple's of Apple's 30%. But like the business strategy, I think Apple's a good example of stability, because you can disagree with Apple's rules, but you kind of always know where you stand with them, right? And you can the exceptions are really well known because they're so notable. You know what I mean? Like a really like Apple's not perfect. They've made some really weird decisions, but everyone kind of knows them. You know what I mean? Because they're so random. Like Twitter's thing, putting aside the technical strength of their APIs, right? Like, are the payloads formatted correctly? Is the OAuth easy to implement? Like the biggest thing for me when I would think about Twitter is like, and it's gotten, this has only been magnified since it was acquired, is like, you just can't trust really anything they say. It's like the scorpion and the fox type fable. You know what I mean? Like if you build on Twitter, like you're going to be burned at some point, was kind of the sense, whether that's accurate or not, but that was always my sense. And like you look at Ivory, the new Mastodon client from Tapbots, like they've clearly been building that life raft for a while, you know what I mean? And rightly so. Like I don't think everyone kind of knew at some point that the likes of Twitterific and Tweetbot and stuff were going to get cut off. It was just it was a matter of when, not if.
Yes. A literal sword of Damocles was hanging over them for a long time. You felt it even as a user, not even as a developer.
Yeah. And there was different things that was like, it was clear they weren't investing in third-party clients as a strategy, which again is it's a valid strategy, and like probably should have been executed from much earlier. And I know folks who've worked at Twitter DevRel. Twitter, to the best of my knowledge, has no DevRel team anymore, but that was an uphill battle, like particularly for the second iteration of Twitter APIs, which was I think in like 2018, 2019. That was just like they weren't just building from like zero trust. They were building from like they had a trust deficit, you know what I mean, that they had to pay down. And to be fair to them, I think they were starting to pay it down until the acquisition. And then, I mean, as with everything Twitter, once the acquisition closed, all bets were off on everything, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing left is it has the same name. I don't know what it is now.
Yeah, they don't even have the same coffee machines. They auctioned off all their coffee machines.
Let's talk about resourcing developer relations, because I think it'd be interesting. You were talking a lot about Apple, right? And Apple has infinite effective resources. Yeah. So you would expect them to structure their developer relations and the way they interact with developers in a pretty sensible way, and to resource it properly. Yeah, some people do complain about Apple, but it's still pretty good overall. Yeah. Whereas if you look at Slack, okay, they were very successful. They were extremely well funded, but they were still ultimately a startup in a growth phase and did not have infinite resources.
No.
And you'd kind of touched on it about, being a profit center and that sort of thing. So how do you, and you lead DevRel now, so how do you manage the resourcing of developer relations? So in Slack, the SDKs, the documentation, was that written part-time by line of business developers? Was there a separate team? And if that separate team existed, did it report to the CTO, to the CMO? Was it its own thing? How did Slack structure that?
The way Slack's team was structured, DevRel sat inside product. So we reported not directly to, but up through the line of the chief product officer, which I think was the right home. I think it's kind of one of those never-ending questions in DevRel, along with like, how do you measure DevRel, is like, where should DevRel sit in the org chart? Most companies seem to sit it in product engineering or marketing. I would personally only ever work for a company that either led me to report directly to the CTO or up through product or engineering. So in Intercom, it sits in engineering. But back to Slack anyway. So yeah, head of DevRel rolled up to the head of product. And Bear was the head of DevRel at Slack. She had 4 teams reporting to her. There was Advocacy, which is my team, and we were kind of everything you would expect of DevRel. We were, the conference circuit. We were the booths. We were, YouTube. We were kind of all the kind of outbound, marketing of the platform. When it came to like the technical side of it, so code samples and all that kind of stuff. So there was Advocacy. There was partner engineering, which was kind of like a real white glove, almost like consultancy for strategic partners. So it was like, we'll help you build your integration. Didn't actually write the code, but like talking versions of the developer documentation. Then there was a team of technical writers. I think they were called the education team. And they kind of, I used to liken them to, if our developer docs were a newspaper, and they weren't the journalists, but they were the editors. So they would write a bunch of stuff, to be fair to them, but they would also like accept contributions from anywhere in the business.
Okay.
So, my team could like write a tutorial and give it off to the education team, and they would like, give us feedback on tone, on, generally the content, all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, I called them the editors because, as far as I was concerned, they were the ultimate arbiters of what went on api.slack.com. And they were really, really good at it. And Taylor, who was one of the early platform hires at Slack and led that team, he essentially created the voice and tone of API Slack documentation, which is like,
it's pretty good.
Well, it's fairly well known. You can argue the pros and cons of some of the API documentation at Slack, but like I think everyone, it's like, is it the gold standard like Stripe? Maybe not, but I think it holds its own. And then the last team was the SDKs, and they were responsible for Bolt, which was like our rapid development framework, and then the underlying SDKs, which were in Python, Java, and JavaScript. Well, technically TypeScript, but
that's an interesting team, the SDK team, right? And a lot of people struggle with this because that team needs to be composed of developers that can code in multiple platforms and languages.
Yeah, they were across 3 languages, but every one of them could get up on a stage, no problem. They could do the kind of typical DevRel public facing stuff. That was like, I want to say we used to talk about it as like 70-30 or 80-20 on the SDK team. It was like you're 70 or 80%, you're kind of standard software engineer, but you need to like not be like, if we send you to a meetup, you need to not like fall over yourself.
Okay, that's an interesting strategy. People struggle with SDK development. Either just don't do it entirely. It's like, well, there's the REST API or the GraphQL, knock yourself out. Or, they have some of the clients are the good ones, and then the others are sort of ropey.
Yeah. And like, at Intercom, so Slack had a team of like the SDK team was about, I want to say 6 or 7 people. And they just did 3 languages, and they did them very well. Like our TypeScript SDK, we converted the SDK from JavaScript to TypeScript fairly early on, and our typings were excellent. And you could like, we really leaned into TypeScript as a language.
That's perfect for exactly that use case, right? Because you have the typings.
Yeah. No, like it's like I love writing in TypeScript. It's great, and it's kind of like it's this pretty excellent fusion of documentation and programming language.
Microsoft wins again.
Yeah, I mean, schooling us all since the 90s. But like at Intercom, we had like my point was that Slack had 6 or 7 people focusing really hard on doing 3 languages, doing them well, and not caring about the rest. Intercom were spread a bit thinner. So like my strategy there is like, I don't want to let down the developers who've come to rely on the SDKs that could do it some love, frankly. But I don't want to do a disservice to them by like pretending we're investing where we're not. So like where we're probably moved there is we've literally just finished creating an open API description of all of our endpoints. So what we'll probably do some version of in the future is like auto generate, tiering the SDKs, and like the tier ones will still be artisanal, handcrafted SDKs, and the tier twos will be like, look, we've gone to the effort of running the open API generation script for you, but this is a generated SDK, which is like not great, but it's better than nothing, and it's also better than creating a false expectation with a portion of your developer community that like you're invested, in that particular element of their success. I would rather be, invest in the community success as a whole by making sure that there's good documentation and there's API endpoints that allow them to build interesting integrations. And then on the second tier, be like, and if you use, so like again at Slack, it was JavaScript, Python, and Java. It's like, if you use one of these languages, we're going to go the extra mile for you because the metrics tell us that most of our developers are here. But for the rest of you, like, we're not going to do that for you, but we will give you these things which make it just that little bit easier to develop. It takes the sting, takes the edge off it. You know what I mean? It's like a little bit thing. And if we see the metrics change and more people going that direction, then we'll change direction appropriately.
Should you be on the lookout for hand-built open source SDKs that somebody who's just really into the service has just decided, I want to talk to it in Prolog, so I'm going to build a Prolog SDK. How do you interact? How does the DevRel team interact with those people if they exist? Do you try to hire them? Do you give them T-shirts? What do you do?
Yeah, the Java SDK was actually there was an engineer in Tokyo, Japan. Anyway, I'm pretty sure Kaz is in Tokyo. Anyway, there's an engineer called Kaz, who when he didn't work for Slack, he built a Java SDK. And he was really, really good at it. So one day we just hired him.
Yeah.
And it was actually after we had hired him that in some meeting we were like, why isn't the Java SDK now a Slack official SDK, given that we hired the guy who created it? Yeah. And everyone was just like, oh, it's a good point. And we just like moved it into the repo and transferred over the issues, and now it's considered like a first class API. I think like you can't do that for everyone. I think you want to reward people who are making contributions like that. So like Slack had a Ruby SDK that was maintained by the community, not by us. And the way we kind of, quote unquote, rewarded the developers of, say, the Ruby SDK was twofold. One, we were a bit more candid with them about our roadmap, and we tried to give them somewhat advance notice of what we were building and what direction we were going, so that they could, decide themselves how they wanted that to influence the SDK's roadmap. The other way is sometimes, I can't remember, to be honest, if we did this with the Ruby SDK, but we definitely did it. So it was like monetarily. We would say, look, thanks, here's $10,000 or, $20,000 or $5,000 or whatever. Like, one thing SDK maintainers, it is important to show your community some love, but an SDK maintainer can't take Slack socks to the grocery store. So if they want swag, you give it to them, but by and large, if they're doing you a service and you want to demonstrate value, you don't do that with, little tchotchkes that you'd get at a conference booth.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also the whole environmental impact of swag. Like at Slack, we were trying to limit the amount of swag we created because, like, who needs another tote bag or pen or whatever? You know what I mean? We had a rule. We had a rule at DevRel at Slack, pre-COVID, that was it just didn't become as relevant after COVID. Was that like we wouldn't produce swag? The swag that our team produced, we would only produce swag that we thought had some kind of useful life. Yeah. So like a pen wouldn't, but like we had no problem creating like physical books which would talk about the APIs. Now, we didn't print the developer documentation, but like we printed tutorials and we printed like, they were more kind of pros guides because we thought like that has a useful life beyond it. Look, we kept doing stickers because stickers are relatively low impact, and we kept doing socks because they were kind of our thing. But like we got rid of like, fidget spinners with the Slack logo on them, and all the pens and tote bags and all this kind of stuff.
Okay, so let's just continue the theme around leadership in DevRel. So in some of the work that I do, I tend to have to integrate with a lot of third-party APIs. In one recent project, I think we had like 15 integrations. And the difference in developer experience between the top tier and the bottom tier is incredible, right, in terms of pain. But the interesting thing is some of the bottom tier companies, literally their entire business rested on an SDK integration because they were doing, specific things, let's say around specific user flows, that type of stuff. So here's a scenario for you, right? So one of these companies gets new leadership and figures out that, hey, we can move the needle quite a bit if we upgrade our developer relations to be as good as Stripe, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't even have a developer relations team, and you're hired, let's say, to set it up and run it with appropriate resources. What do you do? How, what does day one look like? What happens after 30 days and 90 days and all that sort of stuff? How do you go from 0 to Stripe, let's say, over the course of a year? No pressure. No pressure.
No pressure.
It's probably about
I mean, Stripe is interesting because it's like a developer first product. So it's funny because they have a dedicated developer relations team and like they're incredibly talented individuals. But in a way, the whole company is the developer relations team, right? Because if you think of like what I said earlier about like the business having personas and developers being a persona there, like you don't have to have that fight at a Stripe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But so if you're hired into a company where it's like first of all, you figure this out before day one, you figure this out when you're talking to the company about a role, is like figure out if it's like just a whim someone has taken that having a developer relations team is a good thing, or if they like actually understand in their bones what they're getting into, right?
Let's take that as a given, right? That somebody has a company and they get it, right?
Yeah,
they're a former founder and they see a competitive advantage in doing this right.
Yeah, I think honestly the first thing to do is like find your developer community. Assuming it exists, or if it doesn't exist, then it's a slightly different strategy. But if you're assuming there's an existing developer community there, and go like figure out what the company's doing wrong, and don't necessarily listen to like your PMs or your EMs or whatever. Like product managers and engineering managers. Go listen to developers, right? Because your developers know all the weird nooks and crannies, and they know like, oh, don't call that API method, call it this way instead, and figure out like I bet you there's a bunch of like undocumented hacks and stuff. I think, to be honest, docs are always the place everyone should start. They're kind of like there's a lot of different learning styles you want to accommodate. Like when I say docs, I kind of include YouTube and that kind of stuff and code samples. But I think if you don't get that right, you're kind of building on a shaky foundation from the start. So it's kind of like critically assessing what enablement materials you have out there for developers. Like I said, be they YouTube, be they code samples, be they, reference documentation, and just making sure that's bulletproof. Like Stripe's developer relations experience, there's a spectrum of how good they are at everything. Like it's generally assumed that the Stripe docs are the gold standard for developer documentation. Like that's, I don't think I've ever met anyone who's a DevRel professional who would disagree with that statement. They might argue whether they're first or second place, but they're definitely on the podium, for want of a better phrase.
Oh yeah.
But then you look at, Twilio have the best demo. Like the Twilio 5-minute demo is like famous. Where it's this thing where I was funny. I was chatting to somebody who used to work at Twilio recently, and I told them that the first time I saw the Twilio demo was in 2012. And I still remember the room I was in. I still remember like what the event was. I remember like every moment of that because it was such an incredible demo. And the basic gist of it is like, they have the phone number of some percentage of people in the room, right? So live on stage, they send everyone in the room a text message, and then they call a handful of them, and it's absolutely incredible because like the whole room like lights up.
Yeah.
And so I think they have the like demo thing, and they're like doing the value prop thing. So
get to the wow moment, right?
Yeah, they get to the wow moment really quickly, and I struggle with every platform that I work on to be like, what is my Twilio 5-minute demo? And I think I've slowly but surely over the course of my career, in the 10 years since I saw that demo, I've decided that I'll never match it. Right? It was like lightning in a bottle, and you just can't, you just can't recreate it. So I just try and get as close as I can to it. But I guess what the Twilio demo is great at versus just like kind of raw documentation is it like you say, it gets people to the wow moment. Like I'm told, having never worked at Stripe, that the Collison brothers had like a rule that like there had to be code on the homepage, right? You had to be able to like run an API call pretty quickly. There was like a thing famously where they always had curl commands you could copy paste on the homepage.
Yes.
I don't know if it's still true, but it was true in the early days. At Facebook, one of the DevRel leaders, a guy called James Pierce, he measured conference presentations in times to fixed width font. So it was like how far are you into the presentation before you're showing me code samples?
That's so true. It's
that's
absolutely right.
But like what the code sample things does is it makes it real, right? It makes it it sells like the value prop of developers. It's like a call to action for developers. It's like, because if they're looking at the docs, they have to decide, well, like why should I do this? You know what I mean? Like, what can I do with this API, right? Like I used to be an iOS developer, and I always loved developing on iOS because it was so like viscerally real. It was like the software is on my phone right now, and it provides value instantly. And you have to figure out how to do that with your platform. And like candidly, like it's a struggle at a company where developers aren't your target audience, right? So at Slack, a lot of people who built our APIs were developers, because by and large, if your company used Slack, the first team to adopt it were your technical devs. Yeah. But like at Intercom, the people building the integrations, they're not like teammates. They're not the people who are like on the front line of the support experience. They're not always. I mean, there could be. There's obviously, there's exceptions to every rule, but like by and large, they're not going to be the ones who like directly benefit from their work, right? So you have to be a bit clearer with them.
More of a challenge, right? Because there's more.
100% more of a challenge. But you have to be clearer with them about like the value they're delivering, right? Because it's so indirect. Whereas like I said, at Slack or for say Apple or Stripe or the AWS team, they can feel it. You know what I mean? Like an AWS Amplify, which is like a framework for helping you rapidly build applications. It's like it makes the person whose fingers are on the keyboard, it makes their life easier.
Yeah.
And you have
for a while.
for a while, yeah. But you have to make that if you're at a company where developers aren't your target. So if you're working DevRel, developers are always going to be your target audience, but they're not the business's target audience. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's a bit more of a journey, and you have to sell the value prop a bit more.
And actually, your Intercom situation is probably more normal, right? It's probably the majority of DevRel actually happens in this type of context where there are more players.
Yeah, I look really jealously at people who are like they're DevRel for DevTools companies. Because I'm just like I wouldn't be as insulting as to say it's DevRel on easy mode, but it's like you yourself are the customer, so you inherently understand the product a bit better. So you're able to sell it better to your to your peers and all that kind of stuff. It's a bit more of a challenge to like be at an Intercom or a HubSpot or a Salesforce or whatever.
Yeah. Just going back to our sort of theoretical DevRel refactoring, would you replicate the mini org structure that you had in Slack? With the docs team and the SDK team and the advocacy team. Was that a good structure? Did it work?
I think so. I think for the size, so like the overall DevRel org at Slack was about 30-ish people. All the teams were kind of 6 or 7-ish people. I think it worked. The closer you can embed into the people who are like building the first run experience for your developers, the better. So like we owned the SDKs, therefore we could iterate much faster on them. We weren't beholden to like another team's roadmap. Similarly at Intercom, like I'm the head of DevRel, but I'm also a senior engineering manager. And my team kind of owned the developer experience at Intercom. So
there's a lot of,
I am both the advocate and the person I'm trying to convince, and I just have to wear two hats all the time. Which, I don't always win in arguments with myself, but no, I think it works. I think like the SDKs are like an enablement material in themselves, you know what I mean? Because they make it easier to like at Slack, we pretty aggressively cared about like and we had metrics to back this up. That was like, if you tried to build an app and you didn't successfully get someone else to start using it within, I want to say it was like 21 days, then you would abandon it. You just wouldn't bother using it. You would just give up, and it was like a hobby project you never worked on. So like we were like, we tried to pull every lever we could to make your app successful in the first couple of weeks. Now that didn't mean you had 10,000 users in the first 2 weeks, but it meant you at least had like your peers on the team using it and starting to get value out of it, because then you would continue to invest in it. So having the SDKs and the docs and the partner engineering work and the advocacy all under one house meant we had more levers to pull, and we were kind of the masters of our own destiny a bit more. So I think I'd do that. I mean, you can't underestimate the value of a really good technical writer.
No, indeed not.
Like we had a literal poet on our technical writing team in Slack. Like she moonlighted. I think she moonlighted as a DevRel person. Her real calling was being a poet. You're like a good technical writer. It should always be one of your first hires. Like definitely in your first three. You know what I mean?
Undervalued role.
Yeah, but like the thing about a technical writer is, like I said, at Slack we treated them like editors, right? They wrote. Don't get me wrong, they wrote tons of docs from nothing. But like the real value was using them as a force multiplier for other teams. You know what I mean? Because they had like folks who like really deeply understood like good information architecture, right? Which is important and kind of often overlooked, because if you can write incredible docs, but like if nobody can find them or they're not structured in the right way, it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? Stripe does this really well. Twilio does this really well. Zendesk, one of our competitors, does this really well as well. You know what I mean? They like, when you land on the page, there's a really clear guide to get you to the information you need. I think too many people just say, well, we put search on the docs, you know what I mean? Or Google will do that for us. And they abdicate that responsibility, and they're just not as good as like doing it yourself. You know what I mean? At Slack, the docs team thought a lot about like, what was the user journey through our documentation?
Because these days you're up against ChatGPT and things like that, literally.
Which is going to get it incredibly wrong. Like I think the next kind of interesting thing in DevRel is like, how are we going to optimize our developer experience for a world where like people are using ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot? You know what I mean? Yeah. I wouldn't say I sit awake at night, but like whenever a Copilot fires in my browser, I'm always like, is there a way I could be writing my code samples so that GitHub Copilot gets this right more of the time? More often than not. And I don't even know. I haven't had the bandwidth to look into it, how possible it is, but it's like, it is a thing, right? Like, Intercom recently launched a bunch of ChatGPT style features into the product, and I like look at that and I'm like, how can we make this easier for developers to leverage?
You need to be talking to your ML teams. There's goals.
Oh, don't worry. I my ML teams hate me, but but it's the thing of like, how can we use AI to improve the developer experience? Like at GitHub are doing, fantastic work here with the Copilot stuff, and just in general, like I have a reasonably cordial relationship with the GitHub DevRel team, and they just like, they have this perfect mix of both being a developer first company, but also like their API. Everyone who's a customer of GitHub is a developer, but only some of them are using GitHub's APIs, but it means that the whole company is talking about like how to make life easier for developers. So it's like Copilot features. It's about making pull requests better. It's about all these kind of different kind of things. They have an exciting challenge, which is interesting.
Tom, we need to wrap up. This has been really, really fabulous and interesting, particularly the leadership stuff. Go easy with the ML. Don't invent Skynet at Intercom.
Yes,
Try not to do that.
No, try not.
Yeah, I think there's definitely new stuff coming in DevRel around all that. That's going to be super interesting to watch. Thank you so much. It's been fabulous.
No, thank you for having me.
You can find the transcript of this podcast and any links mentioned on our podcast page at voxgig.com/podcast. Subscribe for weekly editions where we talk to the people who make the developer community work. For even more, read our newsletter. You can subscribe at voxgig.com/newsletter or follow our Twitter at Voxgig. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.